Mayan was a famous artist in the big city. He hosted a highly popular weekly program where he invited people for interesting conversations while enjoying a cup of coffee. Approaching his 30s, he dressed elegantly with dark hair slicked back into a ponytail and was fully immersed in that sunny day. Mayan was in a hurry for rehearsal when he suddenly realized he had no pack of cigarettes in the glove compartment of his car. He stopped at a supermarket and, without much thought, left his chic red car parked by the roadside, swiftly entering through the automatic glass doors. To his luck, there was no queue, only a wrinkled elderly lady at the cashier with a bun in her hair, asking the cashier a question while holding a bun. She had curly hair and a nose piercing, and her name Anna was written on her name tag. Mayan got in line behind the elderly lady, distractedly looking at his phone as he approached. "Grandma, sorry, but I simply can't." Mayan heard Anna's voice. "Why is it taking so long?" Mayan thought, annoyed, looking at the expensive watch on his left wrist. "My grandson will send money tomorrow and I'll pay," said the elderly lady with a trembling voice. Her eyes were full of compassion, and the hand holding the bread trembled. Mayan looked at his watch again. Time seemed to be ticking away relentlessly. "Grandma, I'd love to help, but I can't," replied Anna impassively. Even her curls seemed to shake in a gesture of denial. Clearly, she wanted to get rid of the elderly lady but didn't know how. On the other hand, the grandmother was determined not to give up. Mayan impatiently rubbed the tip of his nose, a habit he couldn't abandon. "Ladies, things seem to be taking a while here," he intervened with his usual style, randomly pulling out a large bill from his pocket and casually tossing it on the counter. "Let Grandma buy everything she needs, and please give me those cigarettes over there." The lady seemed not to have fully understood what was happening. She was probably a bit deaf. Anna, on the other hand, looked at Mayan with a mixture of gratitude and perplexity and handed over the cigarettes. Mayan quickly grabbed the pack from her hands and almost ran to the exit. Fortunately, no one had complained about his car yet, and Mayan sat comfortably in the seat, ignoring his crumpled plaid jacket that cost a fortune. Turning on the radio, he drove off without noticing someone standing at the supermarket entrance, watching him thoughtfully and longingly. A slender young woman in a red dress with black polka dots stood on the sidewalk for a moment as if pondering something and then began to walk down the street. Exactly 10 days later, Mayan found a strange blue envelope on the windshield. As always, he was late for rehearsal, so the appearance of an unknown item in his personal space didn't bother him much. "This is a fine," he exclaimed aloud, serious. "Just what I needed." Mayan grabbed the envelope and tossed it onto the dashboard before sitting behind the wheel. Conveniently forgetting about the mysterious message, he only remembered it at the end of the workday. However, when the tired and satisfied man sat back behind the wheel, the blue envelope came to his mind suddenly. He picked it up with one hand, tore the edge with the other, and pulled out a folded yellowed sheet of paper. "This doesn't seem like a fine," murmured Mayan to himself. He didn't know why his heart was beating so fast. Perhaps it was the paper itself or its fleeting scent, reminding him of something long forgotten. With trembling hands, the man unfolded the sheet, only to let it drop into his lap due to the rush of emotions. What he saw was so unexpected and shocking that Mayan froze for a long moment. Mayan spent the whole night on the road and reached the small village, more like a town, where he had spent all his childhood and youth. Memories of the past became clearer and more vivid in his mind. There he was, just a boy running to the lake to see the fat red carps. There was his grandmother buying mint ice cream in a crunchy cone for him, and there was his grandfather. Mayan abruptly interrupted the memory. Thinking about his grandfather was very painful. He focused on the road, even though at that hour there was no one else but him. He passed by familiar buildings that hadn't changed at all over the years. Mayan stopped at a gas station to refuel and buy a snack. Behind the counter, a young girl named Alba, as her badge indicated, looked familiar to him. Mayan observed the girl's face, her dark brown hair, for a while. Then he remembered having seen her when he was 5 years old. Feeling Alba's gaze, he woke up and, warmly greeting her, made coffee and heated a hot dog. Of course, she didn't recognize him. Mayan thanked the girl and left. The coffee invigorated him, and he returned to the driver's seat. It wasn't long until he arrived. He traveled in silence, focused on the road, which he knew like the back of his hand. In fact, nothing had changed there. It seemed to Mayan that time inexplicably had passed through that piece of land. The man turned into a narrow, winding alley, drove a few meters, and stopped in front of a brightly red-painted gate. Behind the fence, there was an old two-story house, a bit dirty pink. Mayan didn't want to look, of course, but his treacherous gaze slid along the street. His emotions were correct. Everything remained unchanged there, and where a neighboring house should be, only emptiness reigned. Mayan coughed, feeling the familiar smell of the same smoke that haunted him for so long. This couldn't be real. The fire had been extinguished more than a decade ago, yet the smell persisted, reviving his painful memories. He felt dizzy for a moment, but followed the advice of one of the many psychiatrists he had consulted to deal with the consequences of his childhood trauma. Mayan took a few deep breaths and began to feel a little better. As he advanced toward the red gate, it was so close now that he could touch it. How many times he had imagined opening that gate in his dreams. However, when confronting it in reality, he couldn't forgive his own hesitation. Finally, he tried the doorknob, only to find that the gate was locked. So he decided to ring the doorbell, which miraculously remained untouched by time. The sound echoed through the quiet air, but no response came. The house remained still, as if it were a painting. Mayan felt restless, and if all this were still a dream, fortunately, he remembered it was still early. Even if someone were inside the house, they would probably be deeply asleep. To confirm his suspicions, he carefully observed the windows. They were clean and adorned with well-cared-for flowers. Therefore, the house was occupied. This realization brought some comfort to Mayan. He returned to the car, trying to avoid looking at the unsettling void between the houses. He sat in the driver's seat and closed his eyes. At that moment, he was enveloped in a restless sleep. He dreamed of a girl from his childhood, standing by the open red gate, waving at him. He woke up abruptly when his cell phone started ringing. It was Claudia, his faithful assistant, calling at 9 in the morning. He didn't have the energy to inform her that there would be no morning program today, maybe never again. Mayan sighed and hung up the phone, feeling unable to justify or explain anything at that moment. Just then, the red gate opened, and a woman in her 50s came out, carrying a wicker basket. Mayan immediately recognized the basket. He had often helped carry it home from the vegetable market. Catching the woman's curious gaze through the glass, he quickly stowed the cell phone on the seat beside him and, with trembling hands, opened the car door. The woman looked puzzled, as if she had forgotten where she was going. Mayan approached her, not knowing what to say. They stood in silence for a moment, and then he hugged Aunt Marta tightly. He whispered, "Aunt Marta." Mayan replied, she wiping her tears. "I'm sorry," he murmured softly. Aunt Marta just nodded. They stood there, looking at each other for a while longer, until the woman recovered. "Mayan, come in quickly. You must be tired from the journey. I was about to go out to buy fresh milk, eggs, and vegetables, but that can wait. I need to make you breakfast." "Aunt Marta, go ahead. I'll just be in the kitchen. If you don't mind, I grabbed a snack at the gas station." Marta led Mayan into the house, where the familiar smell of vanilla and orange permeated the air. It reminded him of better times when Renata was around. Mayan knew that was her natural scent, even after her adventures or baths in the lake. He involuntarily looked towards where Renata's room used to be. Marta noticed his gaze. "Renata is no longer here," she said. Her words sounded sad, and Mayan couldn't quite decipher what Marta meant. Disappointment? resignation, or profound sadness. He dared not ask where she was now. Perhaps Renata had been married for a long time. That idea made Mayan's heart ache. Marta led him to the kitchen and seated him at the table. Memories flooded him. The sensations were comforting, but the bitterness of loss and guilt mixed with them. Marta carefully avoided meeting his gaze as she continued speaking. No one will disturb you or bother you with questions and conversations. The coffee in the coffee maker is still hot. The sugar is on the table. On the porch of the residence, next to a small partially empty room, an opening was made in the wall between them, where the grandmother made crimson-red satin curtains, used on weekends as decoration. The grandfather performed puppet shows, creating pieces that he performed with great skill, giving voice to the characters with different intonations, which delighted the children of the entire neighborhood. They gathered in the room in large numbers, eager for the show to begin. Renata, Aunt Marta's oldest daughter, also attended the puppet shows. She was reserved and shy, and initially, Mayan barely noticed her. However, one day the grandfather invited Renata to his studio to show her how he created a new puppet. Until then, only Mayan had received that privilege. So the boy became curious. "Why did you call this girl?" he asked the grandfather later. "I noticed she seemed sad and lonely, so I wanted to cheer her up." Mayan began to secretly observe Renata, found out that they were classmates, but Renata used to sit alone and rarely interacted with others. She was usually immersed in a book. Mayan realized that whenever Renata read something new, he followed suit. After school, there was the municipal library. He had never visited the place before and was impressed by the number of books there. Renata returned the books she had read and chose new ones, carrying a considerable stack. It was evident they were heavy for her. Mayan decided to approach the girl. "Let me help you with these books," he offered. Renata stared silently, and Mayan noticed that her eyes had an unusual shade of green. Understanding that he could trust her, the girl thanked him with a nod and handed over the books. Thus began their friendship. From that moment on, Mayan waited for Renata every morning at the Red Gate to go to school together. He took her bag, and they walked slowly through the streets, exchanging few words. Mayan appreciated how the morning sunlight touched Renata's dark brown hair strands, turning them golden. He wished to touch them, but he never dared. One day, as they returned from school, the grandfather called from the window of his studio. "Come here, I have something for you." He called Mayan and Renata, who ran there. The grandfather gifted each of them with a wooden box. The children opened them and were amazed to see small ladybugs inside. "Why aren't they painted, Grandpa?" Mayan asked. "I thought you would like to paint them, dear," the grandfather replied kindly. "Sit at the table and get the brushes." The children started working eagerly, and soon their ladybugs gained almost realistic colors. From that moment on, they frequently visited the grandfather's studio after school, helping to create new puppets. Renata fell in love with one of them in particular, a blonde with blue eyes named Lucia. She used to hold the doll in her hands, taking care of her hair. Observing this, the grandfather decided to give it to her. Renata rarely opened up. "She needs a friend." Renata blushed and nodded shyly. So the grandfather took paper and pencil and started drawing. He wanted Renata's new friend to be instantly accepted, so he consulted Renata for every detail. This flattered Renata greatly, realizing that the grandfather valued her opinion. Finally, the design of the new puppet was ready, and the grandfather promised to start making it the next morning. "What should we call Renata's friend?" Mayan asked. The grandfather looked at Renata, who blushed again. "Sandra," she answered softly. The grandfather nodded and wrote the name of the new puppet above the drawing. Mayan and Renata watched eagerly as Sandra took shape. The grandfather took his time creating each detail with care and meticulousness. Sandra was almost ready when something interrupted Mayan's tranquility. He looked up and saw a boy about 15 years old coming down the stairs, looking intensely at him. "You must be Manuel," Mayan deduced. The last time he saw him, he was just a baby. The boy nodded. I'm Mayan, a longtime friend of your family. The man introduced himself. Mayan realized that the boy was as reserved as his sister. What do you like? Mayan asked, breaking the silence. Manuel just waved towards the wall. Mayan turned and was surprised. How hadn't he noticed that before? The kitchen wall, which used to be empty, was now covered with maps of different places. Mayan got up and approached to examine them closely. They were all hand-drawn with various markings. Your sister also liked maps, Mayan commented, feeling a twinge of nostalgia in his words. Yes, she gave me a book about pirate treasures, and that's how it all began, explained Manuel. One day, Mayan and Renata escaped to the lake and sat by the shore. In their bag were sandwiches and a thermos of hot chocolate. She took out the book, and Mayan's eyes shone with excitement. Pirate tales, he exclaimed, and Renata released a cheerful laugh. They spent the whole day reading the book and then built a pirate ship with the leftovers of planks they found on the shore. Later, Mayan's grandfather discovered them. The children were firmly reprimanded, but it didn't diminish the joy of that serene and welcoming afternoon. Mayan recalled that it was then that he and Renata shared the dream of finding a pirate treasure, although destiny had other plans. Do you already know each other? Mayan heard Marta's voice behind him. She was standing at the table, unpacking groceries from the basket. Fresh eggs, vegetables, cheese, homemade milk, and marmalade. Manuel was sitting in a chair, his chin resting on his long, thin legs. Yes, Mayan replied. Excuse me, I'll just go to the car, he quickly stuttered, heading for the door. He crossed the yard, opened the red gate, and stepped out onto the street near the car. He turned towards the opening between the houses, and the smell of burnt food hit his nose. It's just my imagination, Mayan reminded himself. He opened the door and started searching for the drawing paper. After a sleepless, restless night, he couldn't remember where he had put it. The smell of burnt food haunted him, and for a moment, it felt like he was engulfed in blazing heat. Mayan's head was spinning, and he sat down, burying his face in his hands. It'll pass soon, just breathe deeply. The man reminded himself silently, but the visions didn't recede. On the contrary, scenes from the past took over his consciousness. This happened on the day the grandfather was supposed to finish. Sandra Mayan was walking home alone from school in the middle of the school day. Renata fell ill with a stomachache, and the teacher allowed her to go home. Mayan wanted to accompany her, but it wasn't allowed. The whole class was taking a test. Several blocks away from home, he already felt that something was wrong. People were talking anxiously, pointing to the smoke rising above the rooftops. Mayan opened his eyes. The memories beyond were blurred, more like a haze. He couldn't understand what was really happening and what was just in his head. They lived with Martha, and Grandma longed terribly for Grandpa and their home. She hardly ever left her room. Mayan continued going to school, although a wound inside him was bleeding, making it hard to breathe. Renata was always there, holding his hand on the way to and from school as usual. They barely spoke, but the scent of vanilla and oranges saved Mayan from falling into the black abyss of despair. One time, Renata wanted to talk to Mayan about his grandfather, but when mentioning Sandra, he had a hysterical reaction and ended up hospitalized for a week. After that incident, Renata became even more reserved, spending most of her time among books, afraid to face Mayan. Later, Grandma passed away, unable to overcome the loss of her husband. When Mayan turned 16, he decided to run away, realizing he couldn't stay at Martha's house anymore. Before leaving, he quietly entered Renata's room and watched the girl sleep for a long time, feeling like he was saying goodbye forever. Mel woke up with someone touching her shoulder. She turned and faced Martha's worried face. "Is everything okay, Mayan?" she asked. "I got worried when you took so long." The car door was open, I think I ended up dozing off, Mayan replied. He looked around and noticed a drawing of Sandra between the seats. Carefully, he picked up the drawing and, as he got out of the car, unfolded it to show Mel. This is a sketch of a doll made by Grandpa, and these scribbles, I don't remember, Mayan said. Mel examined the drawing. This is Renata's handwriting, she finally said. She was also passionate about treasure hunts and pirate stories. You know better than I do. But how did Grandpa's drawing end up with her? And why did she draw a map on it? Mayan realized that Mel wouldn't have an answer to his question. As he suspected, Martha shook her head. You know, Renata rarely opened her heart. She always kept everything to herself. Suddenly, Martha began to cry. Maybe I failed somehow. Maybe I'm a terrible mother? Mayan hugged Martha, letting her pour out her emotions. Where is she now? Mayan finally gathered the courage to ask. She lives in the capital, rarely coming back home. She calls only once a week, but most of the time, she stays silent on the phone. Did she meet someone? Did she get married? Mayan asked, his heart almost stopping as he awaited the answer. Martha shook her head. I believe there's no lonelier soul in the city than ours, Renata's and mine, and that deeply saddens me. She cried again, but Mayan suddenly felt relieved. I need to see her, Martha. Please give me her address. Mayan drove with determination as the day gradually turned into night. Martha's address was entered into the GPS, and Mayan, feeling that the encounter might happen, realized his anxiety. Meeting his childhood friend after so many years wouldn't be easy, but Mayan knew he needed Renata now more than ever. He made a quick stop at home to shower and change clothes. The answering machine was full of unheard messages, but he didn't pay attention. Mayan quickly got ready and returned to the wheel. Renata lived in the southern part of the city, where small houses dotted the hillsides. Mayan smiled, sure that the girl wouldn't choose a skyscraper to live in, even in the bustling capital. Mayan soon found number 17. A solitary vanilla-colored lantern illuminated the porch, and Mayan's heart began to beat a little faster. He climbed a few steps and rang the doorbell. A bell chimed inside the house, but then everything fell silent again. The silence persisted. The house was empty. Mayan checked the time. It was around 9 p.m. Where could Renata have spent the night? Maybe at the library, but it's been closed for some time, Mayan muttered distractedly, rubbing the tip of his nose, a habit inherited from his childhood with his grandfather, which he resorted to in difficult moments. He was about to leave when something familiar caught his attention suddenly, something akin to what he had seen recently. Mayan approached a gap between the door and the frame. A piece of blue paper protruded from it. Mayan pulled it, and in his hands was an envelope exactly like the one containing his grandfather's drawing. Impatiently, he tore the edge and pulled out a piece of paper from inside. He immediately recognized Renata's light and extravagant handwriting. "Meet me at our place," Mayan read aloud. "Are you serious?" he exclaimed, and unexpectedly began to laugh. It was the best joke of his life. Mayan returned to the wheel, grabbed a double espresso at the nearest cafe, and made several stops to acquire more coffee. He even took a nap in one of the parking lots. At dawn, Mayan immediately spotted a bright orange tent by the lake next to the remains of a bonfire. Returning to the car, he headed to the nearest supermarket, where he bought bread, cheese, and sausages. Upon returning to the lake, he lit a fire and began to prepare breakfast. It wasn't long before the tent started to move. "I sincerely hope it's Renata in there and not some big muscular man," Mayan thought, chuckling. The zipper of the entrance opened, and Mayan felt relieved and joyful to see a delicate female hand. Then Renata appeared. She hadn't changed much, still with her long dark brown hair, the same emerald eyes, and almost translucent skin. The girl looked at Mayan in astonishment, as if she couldn't believe he had actually come there. "Hello, Renata," Mayan said softly. She didn't utter a word, just inclined her head slightly and smiled in response. but Mayan understood the meaning of that smile. He approached and hugged Renata, who nestled into him with her fragile body as if afraid he might disappear again. Then she began to cry. "Why are you crying, my love?" Mayan asked. "I'm here with you, Sandra," Renata whispered. "It's not your fault." Mayan looked into her eyes. "What do you blame yourself for?" Renata bit her lip. "That day, my stomach didn't hurt," the girl confessed in a whisper. Mayan listened attentively. "I lied to the teacher. I just wanted to see Sandra. I slipped into your grandfather's workshop. What was I doing there? I took Sandra because I wanted to hide her, like a treasure to dig up together later. I brought her here to the lake with that purpose. When I returned, I found out your grandfather's eyes. Sandra wasn't in the workshop anymore. So, forgive me?" He looked at her, his large emerald eyes too close, reflecting deep sadness, and Mayan couldn't hold back his tears. "You're not to blame for anything, Renata," he replied. "It's me who's to blame." Renata stroked his hair as if she wanted to remove all the sadness, bitterness, and guilt he had carried with him for so many years. "Forgive yourself too," Renata whispered softly. "Your grandfather wouldn't want you to be sad. He always said that life is to be lived with joy." She hugged him, and Mayan sobbed quietly as the scent of vanilla and oranges enveloped him, bringing him peace and tranquility. Afterward, they had breakfast together by the fire, and Renata asked softly, "Do you think Sandra is still here? I buried her under those willows." "Let's check," Mayan replied. He brought some tools from the car, miraculously found in the trunk, and together they unearthed a simple wooden box where Sandra was. Then the girl fell silent for a moment and added, "I was waiting for you, Mayan. I watched your show every week. I thought you had changed a lot, become insensitive. But when I saw you helping an old lady in the supermarket, I realized you were still the same man. So, I decided to give you Sandra's drawing." Mayan looked at the girl with gratitude and love. "Renata, I've been running away from myself and my own memories for so long, but it was a directionless path." He frowned for a moment, but the wrinkles on his forehead softened, and he smiled. "How happy I am that fate sent me that old lady. Thanks to her, I found you again, my dear Renata." Mayan's story reminds us of the importance of confronting our past and seeking reconciliation, both with others and with ourselves. As he embarks on his journey of self-discovery, we are reminded of the complexity of human relationships and the healing power that comes from forgiveness and acceptance. As Mayan prepares for the reunion with Renata, we are left with the hope that despite the scars of the past, there is still room for renewal and mutual understanding. If you enjoyed the story, share your opinion in the comments below and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to activate the notification bell so you won't miss any video. A big hug, and see you soon.